The history of the space race between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The space race between the United States and the Soviet Union was one of the defining moments of the Cold War. Beginning in the late 1950s and ending with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. The race to explore and conquer outer space was a fierce competition between two world powers. In this video, we will delve into the history of the space race, from the early days of the Soviet Union's Sputnik satellite to the Apollo 11 moon landing and beyond. From the technological advancements to the political and social ramifications, this video will take you on a journey through one of the most exciting and significant periods of human history. So, don't wait any longer. Click here to watch the video and learn about the history of the space race between the US and the Soviet Union. The space race was a Cold War competition between the United States and the Soviet Union to develop aerospace capabilities, including artificial satellites, unmanned space probes, and human spaceflight. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, was created in 1958 as the federal agency with primary responsibility for the development of civilian aerospace research. Early Soviet successes in the space race had a major impact on U.S. society and culture, altering strategic defense doctrines and leading to new educational initiatives. The Cold War in space. The Cold War was a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union in every conceivable arena, even space. When the Soviets launched the world's first artificial satellite, Sputnik I, in October 1957, it set off alarm bells in the Eisenhower administration and created intense fear and anxiety among the U.S. public that the Soviet Union had surpassed the technological achievements of the United States. Sputnik orbited the Earth and transmitted radio signals for 21 days before burning up in the Earth's atmosphere. Sputnik I was launched the following month in November, carrying a dog named Laika. In May 1958, the Soviets launched Sputnik II, which weighed almost 3,000 pounds. Continuing their run of successful launches, the Soviets 1959 sent a space probe, Lunik II, to photograph the dark side of the moon. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. In response to perceptions of Soviet technological success, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, was established on October 1, 1958, as the primary federal agency responsible for aerospace research and the civilian space program. In December, NASA took control of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, operated by the California Institute of Technology, forming NASA GPL. The Advanced Research Projects Agency, which took the lead in developing space technology for military purposes, was also created in 1958. NASA's earliest objective was to launch a manned vehicle into Earth's orbit as soon as possible. It would be the Soviets, however, who would win the race to put a man in space. In April 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first man to enter Earth's orbit in a single-pilot spacecraft called Vostok I. The Americans were not far behind, however, and 1 month later, in May, Alan Shepard became the first American in space, piloting a 15-minute suborbital flight. In February 1962, John Glenn became the first American to enter Earth's orbit. Early Soviet successes in the space race led U.S. President John F. Kennedy to announce the inauguration of the Apollo program, which pledged to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. The National Defense Education Act. Soviet achievements in space were a wake-up call to Americans convinced of their own scientific and technological superiority. One of the responses was more federal funding for math and science education. In 1958, Congress passed the National Defense Education Act, NDEA, which envisioned public education as a key component of national security. The bill appropriated $800 million for loans to college students and for states to improve instruction in the hard sciences. Cube. The act was divided into 10 titles, which each addressed a distinct issue. For instance, Title IA dealt with provisions for student loans, while Title VI appropriated funding for the study of foreign languages designated as crucial national security languages, such as Russian and Mandarin Chinese. Title II strengthened existing public education programs in science and mathematics, and Title EX established a new science information service operating under the auspices of the National Science Foundation. The Missile Gap. More worryingly for U.S. policymakers, Soviet achievements in space seem to herald a new phase of the arms race. The technology that the Soviets used to launch satellites into space could also be employed to construct intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, which could deliver nuclear warheads to targets in the United States. Fears of nuclear warfare escalated, and U.S. officials were forced to rethink their entire doctrine of war, as movies, television shows like The Twilight Zone, and government-sponsored propaganda reflected and exacerbated fears of nuclear disaster. U.S. defense planners began to question the assumptions underlying the doctrine of massive retaliation. Many observers, including foreign policy analysts and Pentagon officials, urged the United States to further develop its own ICBM capabilities and close the so-called missile gap. Although these contemporary observers probably believed that the Soviet Union had surpassed the United States in missile technology and capabilities. Documents that were released after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 showed that the missile gap never actually existed and that the United States had maintained a clear superiority in missile technology, even during the years of the most spectacular Soviet achievements in space. In conclusion, the space race between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was an intense and dramatic period in history that pushed the boundaries of human achievement and technological advancement. Both nations poured enormous resources into their space programs, leading to a series of spectacular successes and failures. The U.S. and the Soviet Union, driven by the desire to prove their superiority, achieved incredible feats such as the first manned spaceflight, the first lunar landing, and the first space station. However, the space race also had its darker moments, with the tragic loss of lives in both the U.S. and Soviet programs. Despite the end of the Cold War and the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union, the legacy of the space race lives on, inspiring future generations to continue exploring the vast expanse of space. If you're interested in learning more about this fascinating period in history, be sure to check out our collection of videos on the space race and its impact on the world today. Don't miss out. Subscribe to Spacefight for more space videos. Thanks for watching.